Nearly all cultures have stories about creatures or beings that return from beyond the grave to feast on the living during hours of darkness. In the West, the vampire has taken on a whole new persona over the last century or so. The roots of pop culture's most famous monster are traced back to Eastern European folklore. However, similar creatures go back thousands of years in various civilizations. One early incarnation of the bloodsucker emerged in England during the 1800s when Augustus Hare told of the Croglin Grange vampire in his autobiography, Story of My Life. The Croglin vampire was said to have been at least a couple of centuries old. Perhaps this story is merely a story. However, Hare portrayed it as one based on truth. A popular form of literature or storytelling at the time was the type that one might find in the penny dreadful pamphlets. These were works of fiction that were usually about pirates and highwaymen and Gothic in style. The following story about the Croglin Grange vampire might be an example of that style, or even the Victorian equivalent of an urban legend. Nonetheless, many people believe that there may have been some truth to the story. Augustus Hare claimed that Captain Fisher had told him a really extraordinary story connected with his own family. The Fisher family had had a long-standing presence of several hundred years in Cumberland at a place they had called Croglin Grange. The family eventually grew out of their house, thus they decided to relocate to the south. But instead of leaving their property vacant, they chose to lease it out to pay in tenants. The Cranswell siblings, two brothers and a sister, took up residency in the single-story farmhouse. Winter came and went without incident. The following summer was a muggy one. On one oppressively hot night, the tenants took the opportunity to watch the moon before finally turning in. The sister, Amelia, lay on her bed on top of the covers and closed the bedroom window. The shutters remained unlocked, though. Unable to settle down to sleep in the heat, Amelia gazed out her window. A church, complete with its own graveyard, stood beyond a line of trees. Her eyes caught a glimpse of something concealed in the twilight. Two flickering lights seemed to be moving among the tops of trees visible from her window. She was intrigued at first, but the longer she watched, the more nervous she began to feel. In a moment, both lights started to emerge from the tree line and into view. It looked as though the lights were a small part of a more substantial form, a humanoid form. As the figure approached the farmhouse, the startled and terrified young lady suddenly found the compulsion to act. Amelia raced to the door, arriving just in time to unlock it. It seems as though this was not a moment too soon. As she fumbled at the lock, Amelia could hear a scratching sound coming from her bedroom window. Despite her growing terror, she dared one look backward. Standing outside the window, almost fitting in, was a hideous face that had fierce, glaring eyes. Bony fingers made efforts to open the window for a couple of seconds before stopping. A new noise made Amelia freeze with even more fear. Whatever was outside was now picking at the lead sills of the window. No sooner had this sound rendered her immobile than another one made her blood run cold. The window fell out, and one arm levered in to open the window from the inside. Unable to move or even raise an alarm, the thing moved quickly and was beside her in moments, teeth nestling into her exposed neck. Now she felt able to scream. Her shrieking alerted both of her brothers, who came to investigate. After breaking down her door, the invader fled back the way it had came. Amelia's brother took up pursuit, but he was no match for the giant strides of the creature. It disappeared beyond the wall of the churchyard. Amelia was bleeding quite heavily, but passed off her attacker as an escaped convict from a lunatic asylum. Given her ordeal and the fact that she regarded herself as a girl with very little superstition, it was perhaps an understandable conclusion. Amelia did recover from her wounds, but she needed to recuperate. The three of them went to Switzerland so she could recover completely. While there, Amelia yearned to return to Croglin. Despite the events that took place, she and her brother still liked the area, and they were popular among the other residents. The decision was Amelia's, and she decided to return, insisting that lunatics don't escape every day of the week. When they returned home, they spent another placid winter in Croglin. It was during the following March that Amelia began to hear the unmistakable scratching at her window once more. This time she acted promptly and decisively, screaming for help before the same creature from before managed to gain access to her room. Both of her brothers responded quickly, only this time they were armed. Her screams also forced the creature to flee, and it was heading back the way it had come when one brother took aim and fired. Despite being hit in its leg, the monster still made an escape. Only this time, the brothers were able to track it. The beast had taken refuge inside a crypt that belonged to a family from the area. The brothers decided against entering the crypt at the time. Instead, they would gather a posse and investigate at daybreak. When they opened the tomb the following morning, they discovered several coffins. Only one of them was intact, but the lid was ajar and laying loosely on top of it. Inside was a corpse with a fresh bullet wound in one leg. They removed the body and brought it outside the crypt and lit it on fire, and this was the tale of the Croglin vampire. Some folks believe the tale never happened at all. In 1924, Charles Harper decided to investigate the legend. Not overly convinced about the validity of the account, he traveled to Cumberland to begin to research. Harper discovered that there was no such place as Croglin Hall. He did find evidence of Croglin Low Hall and High Hall. According to Harper in his 1907 book, Haunted Houses, Croglin Hall is probably the house indicated, but it is at least a mile distant from the church, which has been rebuilt. The churchyard contains no tomb, which, by any stretch of the imagination, could be identified with that described by Mr. Hare. The story was challenged by another researcher, F. Clive Ross, in the 1930s. Ross took the time to interview the locals and came to the conclusion that the Croglin Low Hall was actually Croglin Grange. The Grange did have a chapel on the grounds, which was built on the foundations of an earlier church. One of the locals that Ross interviewed was a lady called Mrs. Parkin. This resident of Ainstable claimed to have personally known a descendant of the Fisher family. Mrs. Parkin indicated that he was born in the 1860s and knew the vampire story from his grandparents. The lady also revealed that the deed to the property stated that until 1720, Croglin Low Hall was Croglin Grange. A journalist, Lionel Fanthorpe, would also investigate the story of the Croglin Grange vampire, and his findings suggested that some of the events might have been real. He learned that a vault close to the Grange had been demolished during the lifetime of Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell was the Lord Protector of the British Isles from 1653 until his death in 1658, which means that if there is some truth to the story of the vampire of the Croglin Hall, then the events that took place would have taken place much earlier, in the 1600s. But yet many people still think this is nothing more than a story, even with somewhat evidence. For instance, in 1968, D. Scott Rogo would argue that Hare's account of the Croglin Grange vampire was nothing more than a penny dreadful story. A penny dreadful is a cheap, sensationalized storybook. Rogo would point to another popular book which was published in 1847, Varney the Vampire. which is around 40 years earlier than Hare's autobiography. The book tells the story of a vampire called Sir Francis Varney. This book actually introduced many of the tropes that are common in vampire stories today. Who wrote Varney the Vampire is unclear, as many writers didn't want to associate themselves with the story. So is the vampire of Croglin Grange real, or is it based on other stories? Theorist Montague Summers republished Hare's story alongside the first chapter of Varney the Vampire in 1929. And this was done to show the similarities between the two stories, and that Augustus Hare may have been heavily influenced by the Varney the Vampire story when he wrote the Croglin Grange Vampire. So what does this all mean? Was the story of the Croglin Grange Vampire just a story? Or could it have been an account of something that actually did happen? I personally think parts of the story might have really happened, but not the supernatural part. I think what might have happened, since the autobiography was possibly written about almost 2 centuries after the said events happened, according to investigations, that something happened at the Grange, then those events became a story passed down orally from generation to generation. And of course, with the new details changing and becoming more dramatic as time passed. After all, stories changing over time is nothing new. Think of the old games that we played in grade school of telephone, where the final message often is different from the message that was said in the beginning. Facts can and usually are distorted, the storyteller playing a role, and depending on who is telling the tale, you might get a whole different version. Some people might tell the tale exactly how they heard it, and others might decide to be like Hollywood and twist the original story to make it more interesting. So a completely normal story is getting twisted with a supernatural element. Maybe Mr. Hare himself possibly thinking his autobiography should be a little more interesting or inspired by another vampire story. We'll never know, but it quite adds to the mystery of the vampire of the Croglin Grange, and I myself enjoy mysteries and vampire tales. Thank you guys for watching, listening, and tell me what you guys think in the comments. Thank you guys so much. I hope to see you guys next time on Tales Told in the Dark.